I am so happy to finally be home from my journey, my odyssey. The tear does nothing but cause nightmares and no doubt PTSD. But let me tell you of some of the things that have happened. That's right. Don't sing so loud. That's much better. First, there was Calypso, the beautiful, tempting nymph who trapped me on her island for 8 long years, but eventually decided to let me go because she loved me so much. If you love something, set it free. Yeah, that's right. And then there was Circa. Yes, Circa. The island on which all my men were turned to swine. I'm not really sure how we escaped that one, but we did anyway. And then where did we end up? Circa told me to go to the underworld, where I met my mom. I said, "What's up, Mom?" And she said to me, "Let me drink some blood." And I said, "You weren't like this when you were alive." And she said, "But I'm dead, give me some blood." That's right, it was pretty scary. I gave her the blood. I'm like, okay, well, you are my mom. Still have to do what you want even though you're dead. And then, lastly, there was Poseidon. The evil dude with the 3-prongy thing. The trident. But he was no match for me. I said, chop, chop, chop. And the 3-pronged trident was gone, and all he had was a stubby thing. And he wasn't very impressive. So he went to get a new one. And while he was gone getting a new one, I left. And I got home. That's right. Thank you for the accompaniment. But now I'm going to have a seat. Hey! Look, that's depressing. Be quiet. That's right. I'm the king. Let me have a seat here for a second. What are we going to do today? Well, we are going to unpack a topic. I have to sneeze every time I say unpack a topic. Anyway, okay. So we're going to unpack a topic today. I don't think I'm going to do them in order. I'm going to talk about, and I haven't really talked about this with you guys at all, and I don't know how much the other classes have talked about it, but I'm going to talk about question number 6. Question number 6. And that question will be right there, okay, right now. And it says, as you can see, avoiding bias seems a commendable goal, but this fails to recognize the positive role that bias can play in the pursuit of knowledge. Okay. Discuss this statement with reference to 2 areas of knowledge. Avoiding bias seems a commendable goal, but this fails to recognize the positive role that bias can play in the pursuit of knowledge. Discuss this statement with reference to 2 areas of knowledge. Okay. Now, the first thing that you have to do when you're doing a topic, not necessarily the first thing, well, one of the things that you have to do is you have to understand the topic. So you have to look at it, and you have to say, what is it asking? What actually is it asking? Okay? Now, what this is basically saying is this, is that bias can be problematic, but bias also can play a positive role. Bias can also do something good for your pursuit of knowledge. Okay? So what you need to start thinking about first, Now, you don't have to necessarily agree with this statement. It says discuss this statement. You could say that bias could be mostly problematic. Okay. Or, but anyway, so let's take a look at this, okay? So we're going to talk about in a second, what are some of the positive things that bias can do. But what you need to do is you need to define key terms. Define key terms. So what are the key terms in here? Obviously, bias. What is bias? Now, you can look up a dictionary definition of this, but you're going to talk about, and put it in your paper. Okay, you should also probably, unless you get back to them, you should also probably define commendable goal, what that means in relation to creation of knowledge. And also positive role that bias can play. What is the positive role that bias can play? Okay, so those ones in the pursuit of knowledge, you could define the pursuit of knowledge also. That one doesn't necessarily have to be defined. But anyway, so what would be a definition of bias? A definition of bias could be the dictionary definition where you're more apt to believe one side or the other. You have a preconceived notion about something. You're prejudiced. You're whatnot. Okay? You can also be engaged in something as a form of bias. Bias, look up what bias means. Look up some synonyms to bias. Talk about bias specifically. But look up some of the sort of similar things to what bias is. What's a commendable goal? Well, a commendable goal, I guess, in the pursuit of knowledge would be to get unbiased knowledge or objective knowledge. Okay? Objective knowledge. Okay. Now, is that always a commendable goal in the first place? Maybe it's different. Maybe it's a commendable goal in science, but it's not a commendable goal in art. Can you be unbiased in art? Really? At all? But anyway, but fails to recognize the positive role that bias can play in the pursuit of knowledge. So what could be a positive role bias could play? Well, number one, a positive role that bias could play is engagement. It can make you engaged in something. On a very simplistic sense, you could say, I'm biased if I choose to investigate something and create a hypothesis, create an experiment, and investigate that hypothesis via the experiment. I'm biased. I want to figure this out. I can't be unbiased. I'm my subjective reality all the time. It's impossible for me to be unbiased. But I can avoid it as much as possible so I get objective knowledge. But that I want to pursue something scientifically in the first place, that I want to put the effort into it, that I want to figure it out. Well, that's a good thing that you're biased to do that. Somebody wants to study cancer because they want to cure cancer. They're biased. Sure, they're biased. They want to cure cancer. It doesn't mean they have to do bad science, but they want to cure cancer because they have a bias towards curing cancer. Who knows why? Maybe somebody they love died of cancer or whatever. But there's sorts of these things. Okay, that makes a whole bunch of sense as far as engagement is concerned, and you could probably tie that into anything. Why would I want to create a piece of artwork if I'm not biased enough? If I don't have an emotional connection to it? It gives me a drive to do something. That is probably one of the commendable goals. Another commendable goal, I think that you could probably say, is that, how about interpretation of something like history? Now, we can't help but be biased. But if I can be sort of, if I can really understand my own perspective, right? If I can understand the bias that I have, if I can look at it, then I can also understand my sort of national identity bias, which comes with me being an American or being Swedish or being Western European heritage or whatever they call that. If I can recognize that bias and that sort of if I can recognize it, well then it's a positive role is that I do recognize it. Then I can also recognize how that might influence my knowledge claims. How it might influence my historical knowledge claims, or whatnot. It allows me to identify things. It also would allow me to identify the same type of reasoning in somebody else's historical account. Like, for instance, if I look at the historical accounts of, the Tiananmen Massacre, or look at the historical accounts of, of whatnot. You know, the Nanking rape of Nanking between China and Japan in World War II. If I understand the bias because I understand my own bias, then it makes it more easy for me to identify the same types of national bias in other sources. And that's one of the roles that bias can play. It also may allow, in something like history, it also may allow me to come up with my own sort of hypothesis and take on something that nobody else has ever thought of. And these are some positive roles that bias can play. Okay. Let's take another example. Let's say something in art. How about art? I mean, why am I inspired to do something? Why do I think the emotions that I am feeling are worth representing in some form of artwork, music, painting, drama, story, whatever the case is? Why is that? Well, it's only because I'm biased. My subjective reality is what is being told in art. And you can say, well, some people do art of external things. Well, it's their perception of external things. In artwork, that sort of bias is what is food for your sort of artistic spark. That's another example of a commendable goal. And any of you who are artistic can think about that too. All right, but on this topic, you should also, you could also say that in some cases there is no positive role that bias can play. Not really in the pursuit of knowledge. I mean, you could argue that, does bias play a positive role in the pursuit of knowledge in mathematics? Well, I guess if you're interested in, for instance, solving Fermat's last theorem or some other super complicated thing, then I guess it plays a role kind of like we were talking about inspiration and whatnot. But there maybe is no other commendable, there's probably maybe no other positive role in math, because if you're biased, if you think you have the right answer, I mean, math is based on external logic. And once again, we can talk about math being real or not, or whatnot, and abstract, but assuming math works and assuming it's real, then is there really any sort of commendable thing or positive role that bias can play? Bias, I mean, you can make the claim in this paper, in this essay, that really the only thing that bias can do is mess stuff up in math. I mean, it's either right or it's wrong. What you think about it is really inconsequential. What your bias is inconsequential, and the only thing that can do is blind you for things in mathematical equations and truths. And you can also make the same argument as a counterclaim in here, that why would we think bias is helpful in history? There's certain things where it's helpful in history, but on the other hand, it can be very harmful in history. I mean, very harmful. You may believe so much of your own truth that you can't even get out of that subjective reality to see that you're so biased that you're messing stuff up. I mean, we're living in a very, very strange time right now in the United States and the world, really. The United States in particular is where I'm living, so. But United States in particular, with, you know, not only the COVID thing going on, but all these riots, protests, the divisiveness which has happened in this country recently, for whatever reason. And if you look back on, let's say, something like the sort of more conservative right-wing movements, or the left-wing sort of movements and stuff like BLM and Antifa, and not that BLM and Antifa are the same thing, but you get what I mean. I mean, these are two very distinct sides of some sort of diffuse middle line. And so if you look at this stuff going on, is our bias helping getting any real pursuit of knowledge? And this is future history happening. We're talking about historical times, which we'll be talking about in the future. Now, is it possible that bias can blind us to things? That our first-hand accounts now will be so biased that we won't even give a sort of objective account of things. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways to go with this topic. So, number one, define bias. You can define it how you want to define it. I would maybe suggest getting a dictionary definition for it, but you don't have to. You need to define the commendable goal, because what is a commendable goal in the relation to pursuit of knowledge? I mean, a dependable goal might be to avoid bias or get objective knowledge or anything like that. the positive role that bias can play. What does that mean? Well, that would mean, I guess, in a sense, that this helps you pursue knowledge, or this somehow facilitates knowledge production. And this pursuit of knowledge is really just looking for knowledge. And that one could be defined, might not be defined. But what you'll need in this is you'll need to make a statement. What you think. What do you think? You can say, I agree with this. Bias has a lot of cool things. I partially agree with it. It doesn't even ask you to agree or disagree, but this is a way that you can do it. Oh, I agree, but it's a good start to it. I agree. A bias can cause a lot of problems, but there are lots of good things about bias, which helps us in our knowledge production. However you want, but some form of statement has to be there. Now we're going to work with a TOK introduction exercise very, very soon. And so, yes, we are. And so that will work more on how to create an introduction. But this is Unpacking the Title 1. After you guys watch this video, I'm going to ask if you guys have questions. And so try to figure out some questions, how you might approach this. It's not a horribly complicated question. It's straightforward. It's easy to have claims and counterclaims, even though it's not a pure counterclaim. It is kind of, because you're focusing on different perspectives, as I talked about in the do's and don'ts. Some cowboy talked about the do's and don'ts of the TOK essays. If you want to claim and a counterclaim, this provides counterclaims pretty easily, or different perspectives, even if it's not a real counterclaim. But whatever, you're not arguing against what you're saying, you're just saying that there's another perspective to it. Yeah, and those are the things. So keys here. Define the terms. Those terms that's some ways you can define them. You need to find your own definition. I'm not telling you a definition to put in there. Absolutely not. But those are the ones that need a definition for you to be able to deal with this topic. And this helps clarify it for you. That's the thing. Clarify for you. You have to get it clear in your head. Like I said in that last video, like the cowboy said in the last video, Space Cowboy said in the last video, unclear thought is unclear writing. And if it is not clear in your head first, it will not be clear on the paper. And if you do not have these terms clear to yourself, then you will not have a good paper, because you're going to be talking about these things the entire time. And so if you don't clarify them and get them defined for yourself, you won't be able to talk about them, because they'll be loose and floaty and the paper will be bad. I've seen it thousands of times, that exact problem. So define those terms, come up with a thesis statement that you want in there, but think about it first. Think about the thesis and say, what do you think? I gave you some ideas, but that's not you might have a different answer altogether. Look at it, think about it, say, yes, it is true, I agree. It does fail to recognize sometimes, or it doesn't fail to recognize it, because bias is really actually problematic. It can go both ways. Maybe in art or something, it's more useful, bias, history, maybe, science, inspiration, that kind of stuff. Whereas on the other hand, the obvious problems that bias can cause, distortion of knowledge, are quite real, especially in something like science, where you have bad knowledge which can end up killing people, like Andrew Wakefield did with his MMR vaccine stuff. He ends up killing people, not him himself, but people are dying because they're not getting vaccinated when they should, because they thought it would cause autism. And so, anyway, that's enough for that, for today. And this traveler must have some more rest. Well, I don't know what's going on over there, but I'll have some. That's right. I'll actually have to behead those musicians because they have not listened to more. With that, goodbye.